who wants to make some modifications to the housing on Bridge Street.
I hope you have maps of the property.
We have some larger ones and I have some shorter ones for you.
Do you have any extras, Tim? Tim, do you have any extras there? Thanks.
I can send you any of these that you want
All right,
digitally.
that'll be fine tomorrow. I'll get in touch with you.
Well, here we are. I'm Tim Geller. I'm the Executive Director of the CDC of South Berkshire. Thank you for having us back. I'd like to also introduce Brian Bielecki, who's the engineer of record at this point. Furrow has been working very diligently with us over the last 6 months, both with the remediation plan and all the environmental.
Can I request that you speak up, Tim, because we don't hear you back here?
I'll speak as I speak, so
Thank
if
you.
you would like to hear, maybe you can come up and sit in the front row. How's that? So just a quick update before we jump into the weeds. As you know, the project was fully funded last summer. The construction bids have come in this week. They look very good, very promising. We hope to announce a contractor in the next couple of days. We expect to close, we're targeting to close on the financing on the remediation piece on June 1 and July 15th for the family apartments. So we're there. We should be in construction by midsummer, and the construction build-up is 12 months. So a year from this summer, we should be leasing up. That's the plan. Just a couple of sort of overview items before we jump in. The primary reason that we're here, one of the primary reasons we're here is a slight change in the location of this parcel. And that change has been driven largely by the remediation plan that Mass DEP has approved. When we first came to you with the project, it's a while ago. It's hard to remember all the iterations of the remediation plan because we've been through many. But we expected to be able to develop the entire 8 acres of the site. And the remediation plan at that point, you know, we have contaminated dirt on the top, and we have, it's oversimplified, but we have clean dirt on the bottom. The remediation plan was to flip those two, provide a cap, and develop on top of it. That gave us the entire 8 acres to develop. DEP decided that we could not do that. And the plan that we have resolved with DEP now involves collecting the contaminated dirt in these berms, capping them, landscaping them, and monitoring them forever, basically. You get the human exposure to zero, and then you monitor that the caps are never compromised. That decision significantly decreased the development capacity of the site. If you remember the first site plans that we had, there was a significantly more development on the site than there is in this plan. So what we've ended up with is essentially two clean parcels. The Bentley Apartments parcel and a commercial parcel. The commercial parcel, we're actually in fairly advanced, don't want to jinx it, but conversations with a developer who's a family-owned business from Vermont that wants to expand it in the Southern Berkshires. They're a developer that has a special niche in senior housing. They do independent senior living. They do a wide variety of senior living, and they expect that what they're interested in this site for is a combination of independent senior living and assisted living. We've had preliminary talks with the town about that kind of project. We'll see if we can't ink that agreement in the coming weeks. But it's by far the furthest down the line that we've gotten with many prospective developers of this site, largely because we were always developing on top of a contaminated site as opposed to a clean site. Right? This parcel will be permanently remediated. Right? This parcel will be permanently remediated. The CDC will then own all of the contaminated dirt that's capped, as well as the riverfront. Is there any questions about the big picture?
You say the CDC will own the dirt.
They will. We will.
It'll be carved off in a separate piece of property. And
They
you'll
will
own
be.
that?
It will be Form A
Okay.
into 4 parcels. Yeah. And there'll be cross easements between those parcels that cover things that have to do with the entire site. That includes remediation, stormwater management, some infrastructure, and the conservation restriction that'll be on the riverfront. One of the positive things about the site change as far as Bentley goes is a couple of things. A couple of the primary difficulties that some people have had with the site plan all along is its proximity to the water treatment plant. The language that is often used is that the CDC is ghettoizing our poor, or ghettoizing low and moderate income families. Aside from the fact that we think that description is absurd, given where the site is, the fact that you've got 300,000 plus dollar homes across the street in the neighborhood, and the fact that the income distribution over those 45 units will go from very low, from 30% area median income up to some units with 80% AMI. All of the income restrictions say 60%, but the tax increment, the low-income housing tax credit, federal low-income housing tax credit, now lets you do some income averaging so that you can take some families up to 80%. So that's a very wide spectrum of families. These are not poor people. Many of them are not poor folks. They're the people that are making the town work. 50% of the families, of the current households in Great Barrington qualify for these units. 50%. Half the people in town qualify for these units. Who are we ghettoizing? Me? Our neighbors? Hardly. This is a spectacular site. It's a spectacular site. It has the biggest sky in town. There's a beautiful view of East Mountain, and it's 2.5 blocks from Main Street. It's one of the reasons why the senior living developer is interested in the site, because in the independent senior living units, there's people are going to walk to Main Street, to the Mahahui, to shopping, to the whole works. I mean, it's a spectacular location. The other thing, one of the other objections to the site plan in the past has been the proximity, was the fact that we were developing this piece, and this piece was not figured out, and in fact, the previous site plan had a temporary cap. We were going to move all the contaminated dirt onto this part of the site, provide a temporary cap, and come back to it later, figure it out. That was a problem for a lot of people, and if you remember, part of the stipulations of the permit was that we at least mitigate 50 feet, I think it was 50 feet, to the north of the buildings, just to make sure that that was remediated, right? Well, now we've got a situation where we're remediating 100% of the site on day one. Big difference. When the residents of those units move in, they'll be living on a site that has a permanent remedy solution. Even though it's not the solution that any of us dreamed about back when we were talking about bioremediation, the CDC spent a lot of time, basically a year and a half in this process that was down the drain, if you want to look at it that way, and a lot of money trying to make that thing happen. We really went to the mat to make that thing happen. I personally made that decision. I thought that we had to go that way if it was a possibility, and the only reason we aren't there is because DEP decided that it was not going to work. I have never agreed with that decision, but they are the ones who call those shots. So from the big picture, I think we're from a location standpoint and from a site standpoint, I think we're actually sitting in a much better, more evolved, more thought out, better for the residents in many ways than we were at the beginning of the process. Having said that, we've provided a memo from the Bentley Apartments attorney to the board. Have you all had a chance to look at this? I just handed it out. It looks like this.
Oh, that? Okay.
Yeah. So there are a number of changes or amendments that we're asking to the original conditions. And this Exhibit A actually spells out those requests in quite some detail. I don't know if you've had a chance to read them. If,
What you gave us is the same thing we saw last week.
it's the same thing that you were sent in the mail, email, right? There's no change in that. A couple of typos were changed in the cover letter, but there were
Not the
no,
typos in Exhibit A.
no, there are no typos on Exhibit A.
Before we get into that, could I just ask a question?
Please,
On the, where you're putting the contaminated soil, how did that design come into place? Why not put all the contaminated soil at the end?
so imagine living in on this side of this housing? Would you be rather looking at a landscaped, gentle slope? It's a 3x1 slope, you know, it's like this, a slope that you can walk up and down. Or would you rather be looking at the back of a 3-story commercial building?
Or the parking lot if that building ends up someplace else.
Which actually someone on the planning side in town has actually suggested that we do that. So,
Or a landscape buffer zone that you can actually access.
Yes.
I'm sorry?
A landscape buffer zone that you can actually access and use.
A
It's another, I mean,
landscape-
it's not just two possibilities.
Which is exactly what we have, is a landscaped buffer zone that people can use. Now, that is totally usable. We can,
No fence around it?
we can get into that with our engineer who designed it. But those are landscaped berms. They'll have a mix of, we're working this out with National Heritage. There'll be a mix of wildflowers and native grasses. The area on top here is big. We're talking 70 or 80 feet wide, right?
How tall is it?
I'm gonna let Brian, our engineer, get into all those questions. So there's actually
You
a,
want to wait till afterwards?
well, there's a question of whether you want to do that now, or do you want to go through all of those and then come back to those?
Why don't you finish your presentation and then we'll have the engineer.
Okay. So, I'm not sure, would you like for me to go through this memo in detail?
I think.
Because
we've
it is,
all-
it is pretty detailed. Was the town council able to provide a memo?
Yeah.
Council provided a memo just before this meeting.
Yes.
Got a copy? Could we?
That's my copy.
Thank you.
The council simply went through each of your
I think you need
Uh,
an explanation.
requests in your Exhibit A
Mhm.
and provided his opinion or guidance on that.
Maybe then the place to start would be if there are any questions to us as a result of the town council's memo to you.
Sounds like a good plan.
Mhm.
All right, do board members have questions? Anybody with questions?
I don't think
Do you have anything else to present, Tim?
I just, on 18, you think,
Very long, we're gonna look at detail here.
yeah, I wish you could, let's kind of go through that.
Go through number 18, all the
18.
conditions
Yes.
that we did. Okay, so condition A reads in the permit remediation of the site, riverfront, and 50 50-foot zone along the northern boundary as shown on the plan will be remediated. So that's exactly what I was talking about before. The change that we're saying that that doesn't exist any longer and that we're actually remediating the entire site. So that condition could be just rewritten to say remediation of the site. That makes sense? Okay. B reads, all infrastructure installed. I think the clarification here for us is to make sure that the infrastructure that's referred to here is the infrastructure for the Bentley Apartments and not all the infrastructure for the site, which would include the infrastructure for the commercial piece, which is clearly going to come off of Bridge Street and not off of Bentley Street. Does that make sense? Number C reads, compliance with all requirements and specifications of the ZBA's engineer. In this case, we're basically requesting that the approval of the building permit, which you know is the building inspector's final approval of the plans, is basically that sign-off, and that there wouldn't be an additional sign-off over and above that.
Your paraphrase in Exhibit A is not literally identical to the conditions in the order. Are you suggesting, because I read the order as it stands to say the same thing.
Can you hang on a second and I'll get it in front of me?
So maybe I'm missing a subtlety.
Do you want to compare these side by side to make sure that they do?
Well, yeah, since we're talking legal language, I'd like to start with the legal language, not an impression of the legal language. If we're
Oh,
gonna
I
make
see what you
decisions
mean.
about the-
In other words, in the left-hand column, we're paraphrasing it.
Correct.
Right. Okay. The memo was put together actually,
Sloppy lawyer, frankly.
what?
By a sloppy lawyer.
No, it was actually put together primarily for conversation between attorneys, and that this was, this, and that this, and that both attorneys had the plan right
In front of them.
in front of them,
So they-
right. But I can read the entire language of these sections if you'd like, or maybe you would like to take a second and read them.
Well, what I have here, and I don't have the signed final order, but I think it's the language of the signed final order. Number C, for example, says, no occupancy permit shall be issued until the applicant complies with any other requirements or specifications that are reasonably required by the board's engineer for compliance with the final site plans. This decision and applicable law.
Right. And
And what
what-
you're proposing to change is to eliminate what part of that?
We're proposing that the building inspector acts as that agent for you. The building inspector signs off on all of the final plans and specifications before getting a building permit. Did-
So we substitute building inspector for board's engineer.
Actually,
Essentially, yes. That's, if I may, that's essentially the way most
Yeah, okay.
projects are inspected and ultimately permitted to a C of O, to a certificate of occupancy. So, in this case, the board has never expressed, and nor am I hearing it now, that you would need an independent engineer acting for the board.
My concern
You'd rather just be relying on.
was the implication that oversight ends at the time that the plans are approved.
no.
Nothing more beyond the approved construction plans will be required. This is a proposed change.
But that doesn't have to do with, that doesn't have to do with certificate of occupancy.
Again, I'm looking at what you want to change in section C. If all you want to change in section C is substitute the building
Site-
inspector for the board engineer, that's.
Yeah, but C says, no occupancy permits,
Right.
not no building permits.
Right?
Right. And to get C of Os, the building inspector has to certify that it's been built to the
You're
plans.
not proposing to change that language, correct?
I'm sorry?
You're not proposing to change that language of section C?
No,
Okay, fine.
no, we're not asking for it not to be done, we're just saying it's done like it usually done, which is by the building inspector.
Yeah,
Right.
Why did the ZBA want an engineer in the first place?
The ZBA expressed no desire for an engineer. Quite frankly, I think a lot of this decision was boilerplate out of town council's office.
Yep.
Okay.
And preserved that
I
option
just
for the
wondered how it got
ZBA.
in
yeah. David did write this one.
Yes.
As I go forward with these, would you rather me read the, straight from the signed permit? or
A
would you-
summary would be fine.
Okay. I think we're at E. The conservation restriction acceptable to the Secretary of State and to Town Council is placed on the riverfront open space. Restriction must be perpetual and ensure public access. I think the explanation, if you dive into the long explanation on the following page, actually spells this out pretty clearly. There's a couple of, the problem with this is the uncertainties that are involved in that process. The Secretary of State has to have a state, if you want to look at it this way, certified conservation restriction. The Secretary of State has to do some findings, and part of those findings are discretionary. For instance, the public good, for the public good. It's entirely possible that you could spend a very long time trying to get a CR, and at the end of the day, not having the Secretary of State sign off on it. Entirely possible. Out of our control, right? So what we're requesting is to provide the town with a local, if you want to look at it this way, a local conservation restriction that abides by all of the standards of the state certified conservation restriction, and that we concurrently pursue that certification with the state. But that as long as the CR that we have agreed to with the town has all of those stipulations in it, follows all of those guidelines, then that would be sufficient. Basically what?
For the board's edification, the conservation restriction would apply to the riverfront open space only, as it was always proposed to be applied to. And town council's response to that request is that the applicant's request is a reasonable approach.
Condition F has to do with references to the shared, quote-unquote, shared parking and the quote-unquote town green. As neither of these exist any longer in the current pen, it doesn't make any sense to have them. If you remember, the original plan, as we said earlier, had significantly more. It was more densely developed. The parking plan was pretty complex and sharing parking throughout the whole site, and there was going to have to be references to that. So.
Are there further areas of concern? We'll have the engineer present them.
Great. Thank you. Chris, I'll get a copy of that later.
Hi, good evening. My name is Brian Berkey. I am a civil engineer with Furrow Engineering. We've been working with the CDC recently, as Tim had suggested, on kind of finalizing the layout of the development of the property, and merging that with the remediation that is necessary to do so. As they've been through some renditions of different attempts to deal with the contaminated soil on site, the proposed plan, by separating the soil and capping it in landscaped berms, is the best permanent solution that the team was able to come up with. The permanent reason for it is there's no need to disturb it in the future, so there'll be no need to move it for additional development. It's kept out of all infrastructure improvements such as parking. There's none of it going to be under utilities or under the building. So there'd be no maintenance concerns, say there's a water line break down the road. There'd be no need to excavate that soil. Given the specific contaminants on site, this is a permanent solution in the eyes of the Mass DEP. To speak to the question about access to these, as Tim said, there's rather large flat areas developed on top of them, and the state's concern with access to them was only limited to the integrity and the stability of the slope around the capping material. So these berms will have a layer of the contaminant material, and then there are several layers of very heavy-duty synthetic geofabric, it's called, that prevents excavation, shoveling, or just downright erosion through the capping layer into the contaminated layer. So in conversations with DEP, their only concern was that the access to those berms not compromise the integrity of the cap. So that if access was desired, that it be through a structure, if you will, whether it's a staircase, a ramp, or a hard surface walkway. So you will see some signs of fencing on the plans. It's like a split rail fence, and really what, with all seriousness, their concern was to prevent sledding down the hills. They were concerned that kids would sled down it and that would erode the surface. So reading between the lines, their real concern was to compromise the capping material. So to alleviate that any hard surface or a constructed staircase or walkway would be an agreeable term to access those places and not undermine the true intent of the berm and the cap.
Remember, it's a 3 to 1 slope. It's a very gentle slope. We're not talking about a
1
mountain.
foot to 3 feet, is that what you're saying?
1 foot up, 3 feet out. That's an industry standard for slopes that are accessible, they're mowable, they're sustainable, meaning they're not gonna be fighting a battle with it washing out.
So it's a 3 feet flat area, is that what you're saying?
For every 3 feet horizontally, it goes up 1 foot vertically.
Like this gentleman down here is holding up his sign, that's a representation of the slope of the side of the berms. Meaning that every 3 feet you go flat, the slope rises 1 foot. That's how we try to convey, so it's a 33% slope, if you will.
And on the sketch, the tongue down the middle has an area at the top that's about 40 feet wide that is essentially flat, correct?
I think it's wider than that.
I'm eyeballing it on your scale.
This berm here, I believe the top of it is closer to 75 feet.
The top is 75
Yeah.
feet?
This, my plan here is inches 40 scale, so.
Okay, my eyeball says about 40, so what do I know? I'm not an engineer.
75 feet, so that from the base of, it's 75 feet up, that's what you're saying?
No.
No.
The way I read this, the whole
I
berm
don't
is
understand.
75 feet wide at the base, and the
Oh.
top is about
Oh,
40 feet
base.
wide. The flat part at the top. I'm reading your contour lines.
Yeah. So, I neglected to bring the scale with me, and I've looked at it so many times my memory is failing me, but I believe the top of this one is greater than 40 feet. I believe it is in the 60 to 70 range.
Oh, okay. In which
What-
case-
That looks like 40 to 45 to me.
On this, along Bentley, it's a good deal narrower, and the one along the south boundary is also a good deal narrower. I have an engineering question. Is there an engineering reason why they could not be consolidated into a single berm on the south boundary?
There's practical and engineering reasons. The practical one is the way that that material has to be transported is very governed by the state. There has to be a set of clean equipment, and dirty equipment that you can't go back and forth across the clean line in the sand, if you will. So by having the material be put into separate piles, it allows the material to be divided and just moved simple short distances, as opposed to trying to take it and move it 1,000 feet, 800 feet across the property.
Do you have any idea what the cost differential would be to do that?
I wouldn't even want to guess. It's a significant amount of material that has to be moved.
It seems to me that the volume of material in the main L-shaped berm is substantially larger than the volume. I know that the southern berm is higher, but the volume in the main berm seems substantially more. And if you put it all in one southern berm, it would not only be a much wider berm, but probably much taller. And that southern berm is already 8 feet at its peak.
That is a very accurate
So the southern berm
statement.
is 8 feet at its peak, is that what you're saying?
What that's referencing the height.
Mm-hmm.
Your
Yes.
sketch here says it's 9 feet
9
higher
feet.
than the ground level of the nearest apartment at the corner there.
If you have a representation of this that I handed out tonight, if you want to look at it.
Is this the sketch that you were referring to? This is,
Yes.
so the berm, the site has existing topography that has slopes all over it. So there's a standard drawing of the berms that references the height above the grades that are out there today. And then this sketch here tries to help facilitate what that will look like when the Bentley apartments are constructed, because we're going to raise certain portions of the property that's going to essentially bury a portion of the berm. So I have lines that show essentially from the ground floor of the individual units, if you're looking out, what that berm is going to feel like. And it ranges, depending where you are on the property, from 4 feet to 9 feet above the ground.
And over there on the west end, is that also a berm area where the apartments are? Heading towards
West?
the water, yes.
This
that.
is stormwater management system,
Okay.
so that's the opposite, that's a depression.
That's okay.
It's a tragedy that this can't be used for sledding, because from the top of that south berm to the bottom of that wheel is a 14-foot drop, and that would,
And then they could probably launch right out into the river.
yeah.
And
It will be
then,
used for sledding, whatever you say.
yeah. Then you said something about fencing? Did you say that there,
At the bottom of these berms, DEP requested that there is some sort of fence. So what we propose is just a simple split rail fence that deters activity like sledding on the slopes, meaning the hill of the berm.
and so what do you do, because kids are going to ignore that, and then how is that going to be prevented?
So the bottom line is that we're responsible for the integrity of the cap. And we inspect it forever. And there's something called a financial assurance mechanism, quote unquote, that is part of the RIP, the Remedial Implementation Plan, that requires us to have in place to ensure that if the cap does become compromised, we have the money to fix it.
So part of their approval through DEP for the remediation work includes what Tim just mentioned, which is basically a lifetime maintenance plan for that berm and the cap, more importantly, the cap on top of the contaminated material.
Would it be consistent with DEP's anxieties about the integrity of the berm to put play equipment on that flat space in the middle zone?
But we haven't gone there with that. I don't know the answer to I don't know that we envision a playground at the top of, on the top of that. Certainly could envision a landscaped area where there are places to sit, congregate.
Well, I'm thinking that those apartments are likely to be inhabited by people with kids who would like to do something other than go jump in the river.
Just a point of fact for the board, the original approval did not include a playground.
Okay. I know we did have a discussion about whether there was
Access to
enough,
open space.
enough space
Yes.
around it
Yes.
for open space.
Well,
And that's been removed.
I mean, this
Yeah.
is still open space. This is-
Yeah,
this is-
gotcha.
We're not putting up a fence and saying, you know, no entry.
What
That's not
we're
what
here
this
to do
is.
tonight is to decide whether these changes are significant or not significant.
Yeah.
Do you have anything further to say?
Unless there's further questions.
Does the board have any further
I
questions?
just have one
Just-
question. I'm sure you've discussed all the possibilities that you could do for building these berms. Did you discuss the possibility of having just a channel, which would be a protected channel where you could move material through without contaminating all that whole site where it's clean?
I'm not sure I follow your question.
Well, rather than just going haphazardly over the property to the back of the property, if you had like one channel, put down some sort of fabric so your machinery would not contaminate the clean soil, and then transport it to the back of the site.
So Brian won't know the answer to that.
What?
I said, Brian won't know the answer to that because it was actually, what you're describing is very similar to the previous plan that we had on the site. Moving, and that plan had this piece remediated and then a big mound here, which is kind of what you're describing. And to get that, you would not have believed the complexity of the diagram that shows what dirt has to go where, when, and what the trucks have to do. I mean, it was absurd, it was insane. I mean, logistically, it was just really insane. I'd be glad to forward it to you. I mean, it was actually part of the anyone can access it. It was part of the remedial implementation plan, the RIP version 4, the version before this, that the earth moving plan was part of the RIP. And you'd be hard pressed to figure it out. It was so complicated. But it all has to do with preserving, not contaminating areas which you've determined that are clean. Because as the soil is moved around the site, we have constant testing.
Further questions?
Yeah.
The river walk still exists, correct?
Totally.
Yep. Go back to so you can see it comes off of Bentley, the sidewalks through the front of the apartments, and then down along back to the bridge.
Anybody else? We need to vote then whether we feel these changes are substantial or insubstantial.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
could I ask a question?
yes.
As far as I understand it, the resolution that you're considering tonight, Elizabeth Orenstein, Galvin Farm Trail in Sheffield, I was a longtime Great Barrington resident. I only moved recently. I still very much care about this project. As far as I understand it, the regulation 760 CMR, section 56.07, subject section 4, gives examples of what you consider to be a substantial change, but they do not limit the definition of a substantial change to those examples that it gives. And it also doesn't define what a site, usable space, ornamental space, landscape space, capped space that contains toxic materials is. I urge you deeply to consider this a significant, substantial change and from the previously proposed plan, and to put this back into public comment and to rehear for this site. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
I'll look for a motion.
I have another question.
All right, this isn't a public hearing, but we'll take a few brief questions.
Oh. Okay,
Name and
I'm
address,
Paul
please.
Iver, I'm chairman of the Great Barrington Historical Commission. And since this project has started, we've been nursing the idea of preserving the smokestack from the Great Barrington Manufacturing Company that used to occupy that site. It was the industrial centerpiece of that Brooklyn section of town. And Tim has been very cooperative on this and has largely agreed to it as this is unfolded. And I'm just wondering if, and the idea is to preserve the base as an historic ruin and use that as a feature on the property to add some texture to the look of the property and to interpret it as a connection with Great Barrington's industrial past. And the Great Barrington Historical Commission put an awful lot of time and effort in this, and I'm wondering if that is or can be that idea sustained and included as part of the overall design.
Can you answer that, Tim?
It is currently,
It is, good.
yeah. We have not, we don't have a final landscaping plan for the riverfront, but as you know, the base is there,
Oh, okay.
yeah. And we've been considering putting out an RFP for sculptors to see if we can't do something interesting with the base, rather than just to sit there.
Yeah, the Historical Commission and I have offered, well, it was a number of years ago, we'd be glad to participate in any kind of interpretive efforts, I think. It's such a neat feature.
Yeah.
And, well, thank you.
All right, I'll look then for a motion on the question.
To do,
Whether these changes are substantial.
All right, I move.
I would like to have, to answer that, you know, the notes that we got from our lawyer, who literally wrote all of the decision and the conditions, he pretty much said that these alterations or these modifications are not significant. So and that's just an answer to the lady.
I respectfully disagree.
Okay, no.
Well, I would like to move that it is a substantial change.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, discussion?
I think it's a substantial change because you now have the housing wedged between these two berms. That wasn't the case before. It's an entirely different site than it was. And I know it doesn't meet the list of criteria that he had, but that doesn't mean it isn't a substantial change in my view. And it's not within my conscience to just rubber stamp it, because I think it's a really bad plan, and I think it will come back to haunt the town. And I think it stigmatizes the housing. So for reasons, you know, of consideration like that, and I understand the work that's gone into this and the years, I understand that, I sympathize with that. I don't disagree with the basic technology. I just think it would be a far better plan if it were something like what was mentioned here earlier, to get the soil out of the way, and that's why not knowing the cost is a major omission to me.
Actually, we do know the cost, I'm sorry.
Pardon?
We put a cost on that earth moving in the last year.
Well, it would help to know what it is.
It was 2 years ago.
Well, we'd be glad to share that with you, Steve.
Well, I think you need to share it with this board. I mean, I'm not the only person interested in that, I don't think. Are any of you interested in that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of interest in knowing what that would take. And therefore, you know, it's for those reasons that it's not meant to be personal, it's not meant to be antagonistic. I know that you guys have been through a lot, and I appreciate that. But I still think that the town deserves better than this. And I know how you got there. I understand the engineering aspects. I understand how you were kind of cornered into it, but it's still not the plan it could be, in my view. Therefore, I find it to be a substantial change.
All right, further discussion?
I've been a bit on the fence about this. As you know, I have voted against this before because of my objections to some aspects of it that you looked at. I appreciate that it's moving farther away from the sewer plant, that it's putting a barrier between the housing and the sewer plant, but it's created another one that recreates the concern that this whole thing is being isolated, out of sight, out of mind down there in the corner. And knowing what the real cost implications are of why it has to be this way would be helpful. I know this parcel did not have any play area on it, but part of the earlier plan had the town green on it. Which was, I know was not a promise, it was not part of the plan, but it was part of the concept, and that was helpful. Right now, we have a place you can climb up to and throw things from, which is what little boys are gonna do.
Any further discussion? All right, we have a motion, then with a second, we'll vote on the motion. All those in favor? Considering it a substantial change.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
I'm sorry, I do consider it a substantial change.
You do consider?
Yeah.
So 3 yeses.
Yes.
All right.
4.
What did you say?
Aye.
You consider it a substantial change?
Yes.
All right. And motion passes.
So the board needs to schedule a public hearing on the matter within 30 days of now.
All right,
You want to set a date?
all right.
I will not be here for most of those likely 30 days unless we can do it in the next 2 weeks. Do it in the next 2 weeks, I can do it.
The problem would become if there is a 2-week advertising requirement, you wouldn't be able to hold it in the next 2 weeks. So I'll have to determine with council what the advertising
What
Okay.
dates are you not?
is.
The latest date I could do it would be April 5th,
April 5th.
is a Friday.
I could do it April 5th.
That's 2 weeks and 3
Friday.
days from today.
April 5th. What day of the week is that?
That's a Friday.
Friday.
I know it's not convenient, but if we can't get in before I leave, that's the last day.
Thursday.
Thursday before?
I could do Thursday before.
All right, I could do that.
I'll just check the requirements in a second.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm not finding it off the top of just skimming. I don't know if it's a 1-week or a 2-week advertising, so.
If it's a 1 week and the week before is possible, that's even better for me. Next week, if next week is possible, I'm wide open, except for Friday. All right,
Should we tentatively go for the Thursday then?
So you're holding the 4th, and if we
Yeah.
need to advertise more,
We'll
then,
have to change it.
well, you have other members, I presume,
Mhm.
alternates who could sit.
Oh, right,
I'm not critical.
Yes, you are.
No, I'm not. If I'm here, I have to write it.
All right, the 4th then, everybody? 4th,
The 4th is.
everybody? 4th?
With a possibility of the 5th, right?
Well, we don't know if we may need to change something, but we're aiming for the 4th.
Right, if we can aim for the 4th, but we can, yeah, okay,
Default to the 5th.
default to a 5th.
All right,
Thursday, April 4th, is that good?
April 4th, yeah.
Do you think we need the lawyer here or no? Town council or
Yeah,
no?
so probably should.
If we have him,
Ask
that
him
would be
about that, Chris.
helpful.
All right, does there anybody else wish to speak about anything? All right, the meeting's adjourned.
Good.